Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I want to talk to you about why you actually don't want to get tenure and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of getting tenure at a research university. So if you don't know me, I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out to get through graduate school that I decided to pay the favor forward and help you out as much as I possibly can. So this whole series of tenure in the last, I've done, this is my third video about tenure in the last little bit. And the reason why I'm doing that is I'm celebrating the fact that I got tenure at my institution. It's a very well-known one that most of you probably know what it is. You can look me up. I'm trying to separate the two roles here in terms of making sure that, I'm not stepping on anybody's toes in terms of intellectual property and stuff like that. So, it is a well-known place, and I'm absolutely privileged to be part of this community at the institution that I'm at. And so I want to thank them, first of all, for giving me tenure, if any of them watch this. And this is really meant to be sort of a no-nonsense discussion about the advantages and disadvantages of getting tenure, academic tenure at a university. And, it's really meant for people that are going through graduate school and they're thinking about getting, becoming a PhD or becoming a professor someday, if that's what they want to do. All right. So the advantages of tenure. So first of all, the way that I think about tenure, it is you're given a contract with the university that you are able to stay at that university indefinitely. So they have, they basically hire you on indefinitely until you retire. And the way that I personally look at it is more of like actually participating in some sort of club that you've sort of done all the things, you checked off all the boxes to participate in some sort of club that's moderately prestigious, right? To some people, to other people it's not. But it is, it's difficult to get into, and there's a check mark. You've reached all those sort of checks to get to the point where people actually pay attention to you. So there is, and at different universities, it's harder than others, right? So there is a large amount of variety, variability, heterogeneity is called, it's a fancy word, but basically means that there's differences between universities and how difficult it actually is to get tenure. And it sort of varies between the two different universities. So what are the advantages of actually getting tenure? The first one that people would point out is that you have greater academic freedom. And I'm going to actually point out that it's actually a sort of a mild amount of academic freedom because, you can choose sort of larger and more riskier projects if you want after tenure. Do something that's different that you wouldn't have done before that, but you still have to really worry about what other people in the academic community are thinking about you. You still have sort of other hurdles. For example, if you're building your career, and that's the way we should be all thinking about this. So you can choose to become a full professor at that university, and so you still have to do things and do a certain amount of projects and write a certain amount of papers and do things that are interesting. Or you choose to, if you want to go to different universities, right? So if you want to work at a different university, you can't do things that are really risky and really taboo that people are going to, just not be okay with you going to that university, right? So if you've tarnished yourself somehow, then it sort of removes your job or your career mobility and really restricts that. So you have to be very, very careful about it. Other people are watching you and paying attention, like these YouTube channels I do, or these YouTube videos. It still makes me nervous about doing these kind of things. And still is unusual for a professor to do this kind of stuff, but I think it's important. I really think that other people find value of this in this. So I'm willing to sort of participate and push this forward in a lot of different ways and sort of build out that whole reciprocity platform that I'm trying to do. The second thing that's really sort of an advantage, and this is probably the biggest thing that's people that are actually going through this, is you don't have to move. So one of the biggest things with tenure is if you don't get it, it's really sort of a stick, right? If you don't get it, then you have to move to another institution. And now some people are really lucky that they're in a large university or a large city like New York, and you might be able to move from Columbia to NYU, for example. Most people are not that lucky, and the job market's pretty thin. It is pretty difficult to get it's difficult to get a sort of academic position in one spot. and not move. So most people would have to move, if not around the country. For me, it was international, and that is totally normal. Most people will move internationally, and they'll move all around the world. Lots of people do this kind of stuff in the academic job market, and it's not unusual. A lot of people will go to, overseas, or people from overseas might come to the United States or go to Canada. It just really, it just depends. And in the world, the whole academic job market is very global, and everybody kind of knows who they are, at least in your academic area. And it really does matter in terms of being able to move to different places and sort of looking at those things. And if you don't get tenure, you'll be forced to move. And so here's the other sort of catch-22 with it. If you don't get tenure, it also means that other people are going to say, you didn't get tenure, so it's unlikely that you're not going to get tenure, or you're going to get tenure at my institution. So you're going to be a risk in the job market, and it does hurt you in the job market. You might actually have to move down. You remember I sort of pointed out that there is sort of a status hierarchy within the different institutions. It's really unusual that there's such a high status hierarchy in the academic industry, but there is between universities. So you probably would have to sort of jump down to a different sort of lower level university if you don't get tenure at one particular place. And often, it's a great thing. Sometimes it's a wonderful thing, and you don't expect to get tenure. So if you're at Wharton, University of Pennsylvania, it's really tough to get tenure at that institution, or a Harvard Business School, really tough to get tenure at that institution. There's just a lot of, especially at your first job, it's just really, really tough to do that. And so even if you step down, it doesn't mean that you're not successful in any sort of way. You were a professor at Wharton, or you were a professor at Harvard, whatever it is, at my institution, right? It doesn't mean that you're unsuccessful in any sort of way. So you have to think about that in terms of where you're going to go with that. That's definitely one thing that happens. You have to move, and it sort of restricts the choices that you can go to. So you can't, it's harder to do a lateral move unless you're doing things that people really like, and it was just a total mistake. And there are a lot of mistakes that happen in the tenure process. It's a really complicated process, so it makes a lot of mistakes happen. Whenever you have sort of a complicated decision process, it's likely that mistakes are going to happen throughout the tenure process, and that's kind of normal. But you just have to sort of accept that is kind of a normal process that happens, or a normal issue that happens. I can get into more of that, but I'm not going to in this video. All right, so the other thing that's kind of interesting, is kind of fun, is more of a feather in your cap instead of these, sort of going forward or thinking about the penalties of it. But it's a demonstration that you're actually moderately well known in the academic industry or your academic area. And that's kind of the criteria at a university, is that to get tenure, you have to be sort of moderately well known in whatever you're doing. And, it's the sort of idea is you're on this trajectory of becoming world class in the area that you're doing. So you're doing all the things that are right, and people are sort of believing in you. And that's one way to think about that, is that the rest of the academic community, it's not just your university, it's not just your department, but the whole academic community is taking note. They're like, this person's actually doing the right things, and they're moving in the right direction. And so it really is, and that's where it's hairy in terms of the decision-making that happens at different stages, because people have different definitions of what the right thing is going forward, right? And so some people might say, well, that's silly. Why are they doing that? And I don't think that's the right thing. And other people might say, well, yeah, I get it, and you're doing the right thing, right? So there's lots of ambiguity around that in terms of recognition of where you're going in terms of your academic career. And they're betting on you. The way that the decision process to think about is that the university or the academic community is betting on you for doing the right thing going forward. All right, so what are the disadvantages of tenure? So this is why you actually don't want to get tenure. And there's a lot of different reasons why you don't want to get tenure that people just don't talk about. So it's something that you should sort of think about in terms of this. So once you get tenure at a university, you will actually be asked to do a lot more. You'll get a lot more responsibility. You'll get more service roles almost instantaneously that summer. Once you get tenure, you'll actually be asked to be on different committees, more committees, doing more leadership roles around the university, both in your department, the college, whatever you're in, or the business school, and as well as the greater university that you're in as well. You're going to be asked to do all these different service commitments. And generally, and what is service? Service means that you're doing things that run the university, right? So there's a lot of different roles that are not research related, that are not teaching related, that the university needs to get done. And there's all these different committees. Maybe it is sort of an ethics committee, for example, determining if somebody else is doing the right thing in terms of the research. Maybe it is, some sort of teaching committee where there is, maybe it's a student is unhappy with a grade. Well, we need a committee to sort of assess those grades, right? And whether the faculty is actually doing the right thing. Everything is very, very democratic in a university. It's set up it's very much a democracy, and everything's sort of voted in and all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of committees to sort of determine for example, if we're hiring a new dean or a university's hiring a new dean, you need a committee to be put together to hire that dean or hire somebody, right? So you have to think about all those different roles that requires people to do that kind of stuff. The other thing that's going to happen is you're going to be required to teach more often. So what happens at a university, and normally what happens is that junior faculty, so if you just get hired on, you get a reduced teaching load. And the way that they sort of navigate that is they shift the teaching load onto more senior faculty. It's probably more mid-level faculty that they are actually doing a lot more of the teaching responsibility at that moment. And then once you become super senior, super famous, everybody knows who you are, that kind of stuff, then your teaching load actually gets reduced, because then you're a famous researcher, everybody knows who you are, right? So you might teach one course at that moment, or two courses maximum if you're very, very famous. And maybe if you want to teach a lot, you can, but you kind of dictate what you actually want to do going forward with that, if the more famous you actually become. So you don't teach as much, or when you're junior, very, very junior, you just came on to the faculty. And that means basically before tenure. And then once you become a senior or mid-level career faculty, then all of a sudden you just have to teach a lot more. You have all these different responsibilities. There is a lot sort of service commitments that might happen as well, sort of in the community, right? So if there's a news reporter that contacts the university, because you're tenured, the university might point them to you, because you have time to talk to the media, for example, and actually talk to a newspaper reporter and be interviewed and, interact a lot more with the community. And that is a big thing, right? So for example, YouTube videos, right? It's kind of a little bit of a service thing with the community, and it's kind of unusual. It's very, very unusual, but you could do this in terms of a service commitment to interact with the community, right? I wouldn't recommend it because it's unusual, but at the same time, it is an important thing to do, right? In terms of interacting with the community. So a second thing that's going to happen is that you're going to have a lot more, because of this recognition, you actually get a lot more responsibility. And that's a really important thing to think about. It is not, and this is where it's coming back to the sort of academic freedom sort of case, doesn't mean that you can sort of do whatever you want, right? So as soon as you get more recognition and people are paying attention to you and they think that you're doing great stuff, that you just have a lot more pressure to actually perform all the more as you keep doing the things that you're doing. So the level, maybe it's your quality level, for example, ramps up because other people are paying attention to you. Maybe it is, just other things, right? So if there is a problem at the university, or that there's some decision that needs to be done, you have to step up and you actually have to do some of that decision making or take responsibility for a problem. So as a junior faculty or a PhD student, you could say, well, I don't know what's going on and all that kind of stuff. And I'm really confused. But as a tenured faculty member, you have to take responsibility for it. And you will notice at universities, the more, the distinguished faculty members, they do a tremendous amount of work in terms of taking leadership roles. And that's just what they do. And they love it. Some people love it, some people don't. But people that are doing their job really well, and I speak highly of my colleagues. For example, I think about some of my colleagues. They do pick it up, and they do a lot of this sort of service decision making stuff, and just taking a lot of the responsibility that other people are not going to take. And I look at that and I'm like, these guys are incredible. These people are incredible that they're doing that kind of stuff, and that's what your job is as you get more and more sort of, you work your way in sort of the tenured system, right? You become more of a leader in the academic system. And so you have to take a lot more responsibility, right, for all the different problems that are happening. The other thing that might happen this is kind of unusual. Is that very few people outside of academia understand what tenure is all about, right? So it's just kind of unusual. Not a lot of people around the world do get tenure, and so people don't understand what it actually means. And so if you have tenure at the university or in the sort of academic community, you might have a certain amount of stature or prestige or whatnot. But when you're walking around in the greater community, you actually might be brought down a little bit in terms of your prestige. And that's a good thing, right? So people don't recognize what it's about and what it actually means and what you're trying to do. And it happens on a regular basis. And you just kind of have to accept that people just don't understand what it means and what it's all about. And that's really okay. And just know that, as you get more sort of prestige at a university, doesn't mean that anybody really cares other than those folks that are in the university. And I mean, it's like that in every single job. So don't be sort of afraid with that, but it's not going to hold the same weight. So if you're a full professor, it's not going to hold the same weight as if you are, a CEO, for example. People just don't understand what it means to be a full professor versus an assistant professor. So it's actually really funny. Often you might get asked, if you're the assistant. I heard a story once of somebody actually, a junior student was upset that they were actually talking to an assistant professor, and they wanted to talk to the real professor because that they were not, talking to the real professor. But it actually means if you're assistant professor, you're a real professor. It just means you haven't reached tenure yet, right? And so once you become tenure and you become a full professor, well, people don't really understand the distinctions between that compared to as if you were the CEO of a large corporation, then people understand what that actually means, right? If you're a full professor at, some very prestigious university, whatever it is, then they don't realize that you are actually extremely famous at that particular moment. And lots of people know who you are and that you've established yourself. And so you just have to take that with a grain of salt, right? You're just not going to get that same sort of prestige as if you're a CEO of a large corporation. It's probably sort of equivalent at that sort of level at that moment that you have sort of gained that respect. And sort of that ability to make decisions and things like that. That definitely does happen. Maybe not the quite level of being CEO of GE, but definitely the CEO of 50-person sort of company or 100-person company, right? It's a moderate amount of success. The other thing that could happen, and people talk about this happening, and I didn't think it used to happen, or I wasn't sort of well aware about that, is that people do become complacent, right? Because what ends up happening when you get tenure is that you lose that sort of threat. And we react sort of psychologically a heck of a lot more. There's lots of research in psychology and economics that sort of point this out. So we react a lot more when we have a threat. Some sort of loss or possibility of losses compared to the possibility of gains. So if that loss is gone and that possibility of losses are gone, then we could become more complacent, and we are likely to become more complacent. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen. So what ends up happening is that to get tenure, you're selected on the possibility of this trajectory, right? That you're moving along this trajectory. So if they're doing their job right, then that doesn't care. You're implicitly motivated for other things other than that tenure hurdle. But that's often really difficult to sort of decipher or understand whether somebody is just motivated for tenure or they're motivated just for the heck of it. They just are they are curious about how the world works. And that's kind of the one thing that we're trying to select on, or what people try to select on, is that they're curious and they're going to continue on working and doing the thing that you're going to do. And I think so. The sixth thing, and probably the most important thing that happens, and sort of personally, and I've talked to a number of different people and they all kind of experience this kind of thing, is that you have some sort of identity crisis as soon as you get tenure, which is strange, or leading up, that sort of a year or whatnot leading up to tenure. And you have this identity crisis where you're just like, I don't know what I should be about or who I am. You have to really think about who you are as a person. And so some people sort of, that's where you can run into problems. For example, if you have this identity crisis and it sort of totally derails you, and then you never get back into the saddle and you never do anything again. The other thing that you sort of have to deal with is reframing and thinking about what you're trying to do going forward. And I pointed that out in the last video, but it is a really important thing that happens to a lot of people, including myself, as you go through this crazy, weird identity crisis. Like, because you've been working so hard to get to the point of getting tenure, or just not having to move, for example, and then you start thinking, well, hell, why am I could do anything at this moment, and why am I doing this kind of thing, right? So what is it that motivates me to keep going with this? And you have to think about what it is that you're implicitly motivated for. And so you go through this weird identity crisis and you redefine yourself and who you are. I'm in the process of doing that right now in terms of redefining who I am as an individual and as a person. So I'm thinking through a lot of stuff that you go through, but I'm getting better in terms of redefining who I am and having a clear idea of who I am. I think this whole reciprocity thing is an important component of what I'm going to do, but at the same time, sort of thinking about the different projects that I'm working on and all that kind of stuff in terms of how I want to treat people, for example, going forward. And you think about all those things in terms of what you want to do. And maybe you want to work with PhD students, for example. Maybe you want to work with undergraduate students. Maybe you want to go into administration, for example. And there's all sorts of different things that you could do. And you have to redefine yourself and sort of understand what you're truly motivated for. And people go into it's one of these moments where you go into all different directions, and that's totally normal and totally fine. And just know that it's up to you, and you have to be very confident with who you are inside. And that is a good thing, actually, because you're becoming a stronger person and defining who you are as you work through those. Don't get derailed, but you do have to work through it. And, you definitely do work through things when you're going through this experience and working through redefining who your individual is inside. And just know that's going to happen, right? So that's a big disadvantage of tenure that lots of people are just not going to have to go through, and they're not going to experience that moment, because it's really like the analogy or the way to think about it is like when you actually go and you're done high school, right? So at that moment when you're done high school, you have to think about, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And some people get totally derailed for years and they don't really do anything. And then other people sort of know what they're going to do and keep marching forward. And that's really what you have to sort of think about going forward. All right, so in general, what I did in this video is I talked about some of the advantages of getting tenure at a university, a research university, why you actually don't want to get tenure, right? So what are some of these disadvantages of getting tenure and what it all means to actually get tenure? So I think that this is important to talk about these advantages and disadvantages. The key things to think about is you might actually have less time for research and dedicated to the thing that you're building or working on. You're going to have a lot more responsibility in decision making, which is good or bad, depending on which side you're looking at. It could be really stressful for a lot of different people. And that identity thing and thinking about who you are as an individual, it's a really strong, important thing that a lot of people sort of forget about. And probably the further you weigh on either side of the tenure hurdle, the less that you sort of think about that. But for me, going through this process right now, it is really, really important in terms of deciding what I'm about as an individual. All right. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Take care and have a wonderful day.